Lucy. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today, not only because I've heard you talk about your book, The Activist Leader, A Mindset for Doing Business, but also the way you bring leadership to life and how you really help, I think, individuals understand their purpose, their role in navigating all these challenges that a lot of the previous podcast guests have talked about, whether it's the sustainability, whether it's economic growth, whether it's new ways of working. So there's so much to unpack there.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you. Your work at Brunswick sees you working with so many global corporations, and you've obviously got experience in government too. I'd like to sort of understand from you what you see as sustainable growth. What does it really mean to you?
It is a phrase that's often used, isn't it? Sustainable growth. And it's got a great danger because it's jamming two words together that people often don't see hand in hand. Mm-hmm. I've even heard people say to me, well, I don't really know what sustainability means. Fair point. But if you really want to know what sustainability means, you can often just turn it upside down. We do all know what unsustainability means, don't we? We know if something is unsustainable. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we're seeing now is that a lot of the paradigms that were about how we drive growth are changing. How we do this is what's at play here. And I think more and more companies, people in the capital markets, customers are beginning to say, is it that we need to change the way we think about growth in order that we can see a long-term sustainable path to keeping growth going and to keeping profitability, if you're in a company, going. I think the challenge that's facing us is that a lot of the assumptions about what growth looked like are literally running out of road. They are unsustainable. So the dialogue that we're all looking at today is really what needs to change, how do we need to change in order to sustain growth. And that means thinking about things pretty differently, having a different frame around the questions you ask yourself to see whether actually in your own analysis you know that you haven't got very far to run on the profitability model you've been running for a long time. So if we want to sustain growth, it's got to be in a different paradigm than it was 30 years ago. And it is a virtuous or vicious circle, isn't it? If you actually sustain growth in the way it has been, it doesn't work for people or planet. But the trouble is, if you don't serve the people and planet, the businesses don't grow. So it's a mutuality we're looking at here. It's often talked about as a trade-off, but in fact, there isn't an option but to work out how to grow in a way that keeps businesses relevant to today's circumstances and relevant to the huge number of consumers there are globally that weren't on the planet 20 years ago. So I think the question is once again, it's back to how, it's not whether. There is no option.
There's a lot of focus on sustainability, but as you've just pointed out, it's also replenishment. Because it's not just about sustaining usage or limiting, it's also replenishing the assets and resources that we have consumed.
100%. And I think one of the things that's happening is that people who have their hands on the reins in many of the world's big businesses are looking down the road and seeing exactly what you've just described, starting to see we can't run this model anymore. Businesses are very good at change, actually. That's partly what's so impressive about big businesses, is that they know how to deliver change underfoot whilst delivering to today. So it's really a different set of questions that's being asked of leadership today. It's not remarkable. It's very clear what the questions are. It's just that most business leaders haven't had to ask themselves these questions before, really. Think of yourself as the chairman of a big business today, and perhaps your most important role is to appoint the next CEO. It would be a very strange appointment that took no account of these questions today, isn't it? I mean, you would think this chairman hasn't noticed the world we're living in, or what? The chief executive coming into a role today would have to be able to say, this is my point of view on these subjects. And they're coming very, very fast. So, I mean, what we're writing about in The Activist Leader, John Miller and myself, my colleague, is to say the demand on business today, the new demand on business leaders, is to deliver financial value and social value hand in hand. And actually the pattern is very clear. The business leaders who do this well, the patterns are really clear. And so we just wanted to say, you know, that organizations that do this well, they're all responding to the same things. And once you see that, it's the mindset. That's what you're looking at. It's the mindset of leadership. Being able to understand these things is really what's different about it.
You talked about social value, and I think for the listeners, it would be really helpful if you're able to expand on what it actually is and how businesses, small as well as large, can really play their part in that.
There's a very harsh way, simple way of understanding social value. Once again, it's through the negative. A lot of what's being talked about today is very big businesses are throwing off major externalities. So these are expectations that people are now putting on businesses, because an externality really means somebody else is going to pick up the tab.
Yeah.
And we've got to a place where the scale of business and the influence, the systemic importance of these big businesses, society cannot pick up the tab. So it may well have been that if you made packaging once upon a time, it was somebody else's job to work out what to do with it once it was finished. But if you are now one of the largest businesses in the world producing packaging, you have to ask yourself, where is that packaging going and how is it dealt with? So the reality is that this is externalities where the world can no longer pick up the tab for the businesses, and the businesses cannot sustain their long-term profitability on that model. And unless people come to grips with it, it will be pushed by regulation. The sort of noise that used to be called the alphabet soup, all the different acronyms that come in on how you report, the fact that the data isn't good enough is often cited. It's absolutely true. It's a bit of a muddle. Mm-hmm. But if you think of that as kind of a layer we're all working on, what you've got really underneath is a long-term pull towards more sustainable business models. We cannot carry on without rethinking what is incorporated in a business remit. And I find it really, really interesting. If you think about the spirit of activism, I would say that I meet a lot of business leaders, and some of them go, well, we can't do this. And you go, why not? Well, have you seen, you don't know whether to answer this end or that end. You don't know whether to use this acronym or that acronym, and the data's no good. Well, so when it's all sorted out, give me a call and I'll do something. And others go, you know what, if I look at the long-term sustainable profitability of my business and see what's happening in the external world, can I help clear this up? Can we find the data? Can we extract the data from our business and see how we can help? Can we push consolidation in standards to ensure that we can all report on these things? Some people are walking towards it and going, whilst my hands are on the rein of this business, I'm going to help this happen. And others are going, well, there's nothing I can do about this until somebody else sorts it.
Yeah.
It is in the mindset of leadership, which is why it's so incredibly important that who is appointed in senior roles today understands the scale of the challenge we're dealing with here and proactively tries to help it happen rather than assume it's being pushed on them. It's a reality we're all having to deal with.
I think we'll start to see more of that as the next generation of leaders come through.
Completely.
Right, because the mindset's different. But you talked about the activist leader, so I would love to turn to your book. In your book, you talk about the different types of leaders. And I would be interested to sort of get your perspective of maybe share some of the sort of highlights of those types of leaders.
Well, let's take a step back, because when we wrote the book, we were looking at the kind of leadership, the kind of attitude and the kind of capability of the leaders who naturally do this well. And we didn't invent the idea of the activist leader. We observed the idea of the activist leader, if you see what I mean. And when we were doing some of the interviews for the book, and some of the people who've done great work around the world, we would try the idea on them. Now, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that for a lot of people in business, the term activism makes them recoil, almost, oh, there's activists at the door. Usually they're NGO activists wanting more than is reasonable, or they're shareholder activists rattling the cage until the board changes some appointments and so forth. So there's a sort of recoiling as if it's unreasonable and aggressive and coming at them. And part of what we're trying to describe is actually, suppose you took the move, suppose you weren't on the receiving end of it, but you actually stepped into the change that's needed rather than had it forced out of you. Businesses need to be in this arena because actually businesses do know about implementation. They know about getting stuff done. And they rise to the challenge that there's something practical that needs doing here. Or R.J. Banger, who's since gone off to the World Bank, said, funny kind of leadership that's not activist. What are the types of activism? One of the reasons that people are worried about the term activism is that it sounds so sort of noisy or aggressive. But actually, if you think about what is the spirit of activism really, what's at the heart of the idea, I would say it's an individual who looks at a very, very complex, difficult, intractable situation and sees its reality for what it is. And then in relation to that thing, there's a turnaround suddenly. Instead of going, I hope somebody does something about it, goes, I think I should do something about that. I think I could do something about it. And steps towards it. And then they don't necessarily assume, in fact, they don't assume that they are the person to fix it, but rather that they mobilize the resource. They know how to move resources and energy and talent and imagination into that problem to get things done. Well, a lot of business leaders would pride themselves on exactly that quality. So one of the things we did almost for fun, really, was describe the idea that there were maybe archetypes. So what are the archetypes? Well, an archetype, for example, would be the fixer. So you think of John Henry Dunant. He found himself in the 19th century caught on the edge of the Battle of Solferino. He's a businessman. And he suddenly saw this and thought, this isn't the way. Let me send it up for a moment to manage this. That was the beginning of the Red Cross. That was somebody who went, whoa, wait a second, this isn't okay. I can imagine that we could mobilize resources to manage the terrors of the battlefield a little bit better for those who are wounded and left behind. Or you take Peter Benenson. He was a lawyer sitting on the tube in London, reading about Portuguese students really pushing themselves out there to fight for their rights. That was the beginning of Amnesty International. That's a lawyer, just very quietly going, I could do something about this. Point is, what in your personality, what in your way of operating as a leader can you bring to bear to change things when you see very clearly that they need changing? You're not the whole answer.
Yeah.
But you have a piece of that answer. You have a way of relating to that answer and something to bring to it. And we're looking at some of the world's biggest businesses today. Huge organizations with massive economic power across often more than 100 markets in the world. Now, those are systemically important businesses. They have resources, imagination, the power to innovate, the power to mobilize people, power to work with governments. One of the questions we're asked over and over again is, yes, but how do you know which problems to get involved with? Well, actually, that's not exactly straightforward, but it is very clear how you go about it. You look for the intersection between yourself and that big challenge in the outside world, which will, in the end, come back home to roost in your organization. And oddly, in mindset terms, even that is a shift. When I began to do this kind of work over 10 years ago, you'd often turn up in an organization and talk about social value. Always mark. Somebody would say, very interesting idea. There'll be somebody down the corridor, who is interested in this kind of thing. Well, now you walk into a big business, everybody on the board, everybody in the executive knows it's a question. They may not know the answers yet, but they know this is a question. This has gone absolutely central. This has gone right up the priority list. But the idea that it is sometimes the most intractable, the biggest, most difficult questions, that worries people. So we've sat with business leaders and they've gone, they make burgers. What about, let's talk about meat supply chain. That's a very difficult one. We get criticism a lot. Could we talk about this one? No, we can't. I mean, we can, but it's not going to make any difference. Go for the one that's difficult. If you are a palm oil business, it's going to be deforestation. So it'll be the thing where the problem is. It'll be the thing where society is seeing the externalities. It'll be the thing where the pressure is coming on from the regulators because they cannot pick up the tab on your externalities as a business. You are going to be challenged on the resilience and the sustainability of your own growth if you don't grip it.
And the impact you have in society around you. So some of the things that, people don't always talk about social value. They understand the concept, but people often talk about role of business in society because, as you said, it's sort of disconnected from the business. We want to do something, we have to drive change, but it's slightly disconnected. I think what you're talking about is how do you as an activist leader drive systemic change?
Exactly. How do you drive change in your business and drive systemic change?
Yeah.
One of the things we do in the book is set out, we call them 9 steps. Reflection, I'm not sure they're steps because they all happen at the same time. But they are kind of 9 definable ways that everybody who does this well, every organization, every business leader, you can find your way in those steps. And unsurprisingly, sometimes we're asked by the companies we work with, well, if we had to pick one that makes the difference. Of course, if you've identified 9, you can see the 9 very clearly. But if you had to go for one, you'd go for systemic change. The thing that is the difference between the leaders now and the leaders 10 years ago, or even the leaders 5 years ago, is that they see that the game is systemic change. An example we use in the book, which I think is really clarifying for people, is the Maersk example on shipping. And Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, has this picture in mind's eye. We make ships. Once they're on the ocean, they're lasting 30, 35 years, lifetime. And the shipping industry was in an absolute catch-22. They're all run on fossil fuels, every ship, partly because there's no real supply of anything other than fossil fuels. Meanwhile, there's no fossil fuel supply because all the ships run on fossil fuels. So you're in a sort of lock. And every company was going, well, not much we can do about it. But with that activist mindset, Maersk came in and went, we've got to break this deadlock because the ships we put on the ocean today will be there in 2050. They'll be operating at the time when we're trying to have decarbonized the world. So they commissioned the first ever ships to run on something other than fossil fuel, just 8 of them. But by making that possible and putting them on the ocean, they absolutely raised the bar. That's in their own operations. But in order to achieve that, they worked beyond the organization. So they worked with their supply chain. The distributors, the big companies that put stuff on their ships to distribute around the world, helped them underwrite it. In other words, we'll be there when you produce those ships. At the same time, they're building up supply of green methanol for those ships. And then actually they're saying that shouldn't the industry be doing that? So they start working with the industry bodies to map out the future of the story that actually says, how could we shift the whole industry quicker? And by the way, quietly calling for a carbon price for the industry because otherwise it won't happen. So they're working in the business to deliver the bit they can deliver. They're working beyond the business through the network of influence they have in their distributors and in their value chains and so forth. And then they're actually working out into the world to call, to advocate for the things that need to happen to accelerate this. Now, that is an activist position, and it's a system-wide view. That's where the leaders are today. They're not just going, oh, I've tidied up my own back garden, I hope the world's okay. They're recognizing that as a large player, they have levers to pull and opportunities to change the game system-wide. That's where the front edge is now. That's where all the imaginative work is being done.
That's a really lovely example, as you say, of the internal, external, and then influence in terms of how business can play its part. And actually, you touch on something that a lot of guests on the podcast talk about, that challenge around long-term vision, purpose, and delivering against the short-term expectations. And you've alluded to the fact that, it's evolving.
Yes.
Reporting is helping us evolve in how we sort of mature in the way that we, build our businesses, etc. But in your work, what have you seen, or how are you advising businesses?
Very often, the analysis that businesses do on these kinds of questions is, if you like, corporate-centric, is a way we talk about it. How is this going to affect us? Oh dear, we're going to be regulated. How can we stop that regulation? Because we don't want it to affect us. We sort of laughingly think of it as a citadel, There's the big business and its fortress, and it's looking down on the world and keeping those issues away. In today's world, you've actually got to let down that drawbridge, go out into that world and look at those issues. And it's surprisingly few business leaders actually say, bring me the intelligence on where these issues are going in the world. Actually, what is happening in the world that we need to take account of. Very interesting approach from Walmart, who you would hardly think of as an activist company in societal terms, made huge commitments recently on regenerative agriculture. How did they get there? Really interesting. The very senior people in the business went and got educated. They went and got educated about pollination, about soil health, about things that are actually happening in the world that are going to change their growth trajectory. And then talk to their suppliers about it. Really impressive, bringing your senior leaders and then bringing the people who taught you about pollination. We need you to understand this, and you're going to have to make some commitments to work with us. One of the things that really struck me is that the business leaders who have pulled this off are quite straightforward in talking to their investor base about why it needs to happen. The thing one's trying to break up is exactly what you talked about a moment ago. It's not we're running the business and then somehow society is asking us to be good to society. This is how you run your business for the long term, and are you strategically alert to the questions that are being brought to you. It's very interesting. We did, one of the steps we talk about is building it into the core. Mentioned plastics earlier. Coca-Cola is the worst plastic polluter on the planet. Just such a big brand. They wouldn't have meant to be that. And they came top of the rankings several years in a row of you could find their plastic on more beaches around the world than anybody else's. And eventually the business said, we can't have that. In the end, we can't have that. Not only will the regulators move in, but the damage to the brand. That's not an okay position. But they didn't have the data when they began. And when we spoke to James Quincy, who runs Coca-Cola, and said, how did you do this? He just kept repeating, you just build it into the strategy like you do anything else. So the business asked every market to understand what their data was on plastic waste. It had not happened before. It's back to that mindset. Data doesn't exist. Can you go get it? Once you've got it and then you publish it, you've made clear to the world you're going to drive it down. And you have a 5-year plan to drive it down. And when I said to James Quincy, how do you do that? He said, well, I expect everything else to report to me. Jamie Dimon said the same. Once I take on something like this, I build it into how I run the business as I do everything else. So I think the latest generation of thinking here isn't I'm running the business and then I better look over my shoulder to do something nice for society. It's actually wrapped into how the business is organized and run, and the same expectations are put on it for strategic imperative and clarity of delivery.
So one of the things you've just highlighted is this focus on sort of biodiversity in nature and the plastics problem. And it's quite interesting because the Tech Innovator in the UK competition that we run every year, this year's entries, the final 8 that presented, of those, half of them actually addressed one of those 2 issues. In fact, our winner this year was a company called Halo Cycle, which has got an innovative technology to be able to break down plastic. So it's actually really interesting that we're beginning to see these disruptors come through, which will be the disruptors that help the larger companies in their own evolution and disruption.
Most small businesses, actually, if you look under the surface, are attached somewhere into the supply chains of the big businesses. Yeah. And plastics is a very good, interesting example of lots of innovative, disruptive work going on in small businesses that feeds through. In fact, what you see, which I think is actually very encouraging, is that people are getting more and more skilled at bringing the ecosystem that's needed to the table. What I think you see now much more is that there's what we call them actually activist coalitions, groups of organizations, some of them big businesses, some of them small, some of them academics actually at the front edge of research, some of them governments anywhere from intergovernmental to local governments, working together to say, how do we get a fix on this problem? Everything from cage-free hens to women's salaries in Pakistan. There's gathering around a problem, bringing the ecosystem to it and working out what role everybody plays to drive the whole thing forward. That's where the new inventiveness is coming from, I think.
I think that also plays into geographical differences, sort of helping learn from our, different companies, different countries do things better than others. And so it's how do you learn from that? Some of the things that I hear from leaders is, the growing expectation on a leader, not just about running a business, but also in the voice that they have in the market. And I know you have very clear views on this. how does a leader really sort of put those guardrails around, when is it appropriate to speak up on something?
It's such a live question, isn't it? And it's probably, if I look back over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, it's like a sort of literally a live wire. You can feel people sort of vibrating with the pressure on when do you speak up and when do you not speak up. The reality is, in the end, of course, it's always a judgment in the moment, and it's judgment, nothing more than that. But I think that there are some things that one can reflect on that are helpful. It goes back very straightforwardly to, is this issue something that is relevant to the business? By which I mean, is there actually an intersection with something that's going on in the organization? Which leads you very quickly to, if there is, what are we, this business, thinking, saying, doing about it already? Crucially, doing about it. And then, does that actually help you? Because that is the springboard, that is the foundation for what you come out and say. Now, it's not quite as straightforward as that. Another question that comes out of it is, and if you use your voice in this way, did you make any difference? Does it actually help the issue in some way? So we've worked with a lot of business leaders who were very exercised with Roe v. Wade. I've had many a business leader work in a sort of heavy engineering business or so, saying, I never thought my job as a senior leader in this business was going to be to talk about abortion. How did I get there? So it's quite a challenge to individuals. However, what you actually saw was lots of businesses coming out and saying, well, this is how we think about women and their health in our business and the rights and benefits we give to our employees on the subject of women and health. And that's why we would continue to stand up for those, because we have a population of however many people it is work in this business, and we've spent a lot of years working out what is the best way to deal with this and the best way to support our employees, and we're speaking from that base. So they're not commenting on a Roe v. Wade judgment in the courts or the political storm that arises around it. They're going, we see that this is a live and contested issue. Insofar as it has anything to do with us, it's how we think about it and how we deal with it with our workforces this way, and that's why we think we should talk about it. Now, that has a sort of somewhat calming effect. However, the reality is that in today's world, because communications have changed so much, a lot of people are bringing into the business in a way they never were before. Lots of influences and thoughts and concerns, and there are employees pushing business leaders to speak up. And so, again, what you're hearing is, I can't speak up because there's some people on one side of the story and other people on the other side of the story. What can I say? And the reality is, it still goes back to, what is the issue? Where is the intersection with your business? Are you doing anything about it already today? If not, is this new thing that's arrived so serious that you're prepared to do something about it? And if you're not actually going to do something, be really careful on raising your voice, because that last question in the storyline is, what difference does it make if you do? Usually, in those pressures, you can, as a business leader, speak to the fact that this is contested, that this is difficult, and that what you're focused on is the impact on individuals. The pressure is so extreme in some parts of the world, in America very vividly at the moment, but not only in America, that the one thing I think one does ask business leaders to keep an eye on is, by entering this conversation, are you actually stepping off balance and into a political storyline? There are such contested storylines pushing on businesses to speak that you can almost feel people go off balance and answer a question that is fundamentally a politicized question. And suddenly you're on the terms of political debate. That wasn't your area, unless you choose to. You can choose to, but watch that you don't get pushed off balance into a political contested arena for the sake of saying something. Always pull back and ask yourself, where does this intersect with my business or the humanity and concerns of the individuals in this business? And speak from that and what you do and are prepared to do. It does stop you for a moment before you enter everything if you go through that checklist in your own mind's eye.
What a fascinating role you have working with organisations.
Well,
across
you
this.
too.
Oh yeah, I
mean-
do. But a lot of the work that you do around leadership, because we do know a lot of the conversation we have is around culture in an organisation, the purpose, bringing that vision to life. But actually, a lot of that comes from the leadership.
Yes.
So what we've explored today is, the leadership of the future, or the leadership that we're having today, and how's that going to evolve as we look forward to some of the really complex challenges that we're all facing.
We've talked a lot about the CEO, but actually, this is very distributed. A lot of change is created in the R&D department. A lot of change is created through the supply chains and how you procure and how you equip supply chains to deal with this and invest in supply chains to deal with this. A lot of this is how you talk to your customers about these questions. So, we're not talking just about the CEO. And the other question we get asked is from young people, but I'm just a young person in the organization. How can I influence it? Well, every single conversation I've ever had with a senior leader is we're being asked by the younger people in the organization. Well, just keep asking. That's how you can help. Keep asking, because the senior leaders are definitely taking that seriously.
You have given us lots of sort of examples of proactiveness, resilience, the intergenerational challenge in terms of thinking. Talked about collaboration, whether it's the footprint in what you can affect change and the handprint in terms of the supply chain, the influence that you have. As you look forward, we've talked about sort of new demands on leadership. How would you describe the key qualities of that sort of evolving leadership role?
I think that maybe what is worth saying is that when you see businesses and business leaders who have built this into the way they operate the business, they really enjoy it. They actually, it makes you a bigger leader. It makes you somebody who's not just running on the machine to the next quarter. It makes you somebody who's actually thinking about the role your business plays in the world. And the more significant you think your business is, the more relevant you think your business is, the more you will naturally want to take on these subjects. You can literally see people grow into a different kind of leadership. The qualities that make a really strong business leader are the same qualities. Can you look at the situation you're in really clearly? Do you actually talk properly to people about the problems and not just the upside?
Yeah.
Can you actually inspire people to deliver on things they haven't done before? Are you intrigued by the innovative capability of your business, the potential to do things a new way, in a different way, to suit a different need? This is what business leaders love to do, to deliver new solutions to new problems in a way that grows the business, that keeps it relevant and sustains its long-term prospects.
As you sort of look back on your career, because you've had an incredible career, right? Not just in the role that you have at Brunswick today, but even in government, and you've, led a focus on talent, etc. If you sort of look back in your career and your sort of your journey, is there anything that you'd like to sort of pass on to the next generation?
Oh, sounds rather grand to want to pass something on to the next generation. I think that one of the things that has most helped and run as a red thread through everything I've been able to do is listening. Really, really listen. It sounds obvious, doesn't it? Do you actually know what's going on out there? And when you go and listen to the experts, what are they actually telling you? If you care about the young people in the business, can you hear what's concerning them? And when you are in dialogue to try and build your strategy or build your thinking, really listen, because that gives you the content, that gives you the ability to make a case and make a case for change if needed. So I think listening in its many forms is probably a secret ingredient for a lot of being able to get change delivered.
What a wonderful piece of advice. Listen. And not just listen because it suits you, but listen because it matters. And it brings me right back to the beginning. A lot of what you've talked about today in terms of leadership mindset and action is around challenging the status quo.
Yes.
not just deferring to the skills that we have learnt, but really challenge. And you use the word framing, which I think is a really important word to just reflect on, to reframe the situation we're in, the situation we're facing into. You've given some real great insight into the types of leaders, and we can either tick or not to each of those sort of archetypes. And also when to speak up. There's a lot of pressure on individuals as leaders, as much as it is on teams of leadership. And being really clear on the purpose, the long-term vision, and actually the role you play and how you can drive systemic change. I think it's a how do you drive systemic change. Thank you so much for your time today, Lucy, and all the insights that you've shared. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Really fun to talk to you.